So I'm going to introduce Martin Tully, and he's going to introduce our panelists. And Martin's all yours, brother.
Thank you, Professor. Good morning. And we are acutely aware that we are the last thing standing between you and lunch. So we've got a lot to cover in 50 minutes with respect to navigating the sea of cyber threats. As mentioned, my name is Martin Tully. I am a partner with the law firm of Ackerman LLP. I'm based in the Chicago office there. And my role, among other things, as a 27-plus year litigator, is also I'm the co-chair of the firm's data law practice, which covers electronic discovery, information governance, cybersecurity, data privacy, Internet of Things, autonomous cars, drones, but all that wouldn't fit on the card, so we call it data law. And as was previously mentioned, my volunteer job on the side is I'm also the mayor of my town of population 50,000, which is in DuPage County. I say that because DuPage County and Cook County are very, very different. And I'm very pleased to be here today and to be working with St. Mary's University on this conference, and we've got such amazing speakers. I want to thank all those that are both spoke already and those that will speak again later today. Truly an outstanding effort. I want to thank all the sponsors for making this possible, and thank you to Professor Edicott and everyone else for organizing such a great forum, and glad to see you all here. To my left are two very impressive individuals in their own right. The first person is not, in fact, Ron Plesko, but playing the role of Ron Plesko today will be Keith Lowry. And Keith, I'll let you briefly introduce yourself.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be back in the state of Texas. I have three major careers that I've done in my life. One was first as a police officer and detective in the great state of California. In San Jose, where we formed one of the first cybersecurity or cyber cop crime units way back in the late 80s and the early 90s. My second career was with the U.S. military, where I served as an intelligence officer, and I did work in counterintelligence, counterterrorism, and insider threat. I worked, the last thing that I did was work for another agency of the U.S. government, where I set up a counterintelligence and insider threat program, and then I left and retired finally and went into private practice or private commercial entities with a company called Mimics, and that's who I am.
Thank you. And to Keith's immediate right is Jason Strait. Jason, quick self-introduction, please.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everybody. Jason Strait. I run the Cyber Risk Solutions practice at United Lex. And what we do in that business is really help organizations manage cyber risk in a variety of different ways. We do digital forensics and incident response work. So that's, if I look back over my career, that's where I've spent the majority of my time, is helping companies respond when something's going wrong. Somebody bad has got in, data's gotten out, and they're trying to figure out what's happened. I've also taken that experience and built a consulting practice where we help companies avoid those things from happening in the first place, or at least be better prepared for them to occur. And so we have a risk advisory service at United Lex as well. And then third, we have a 24/7 security operations center where we offer a managed detection and response services to companies, mainly focused in the middle market, helping organizations that otherwise, don't have or can't afford, the best tools and best people. We provide that as a service. So that's what I'm doing today. If you look back over my career, I actually started my career as an attorney, not as high-powered as Martin, but left practice over 15 years ago now, and have been working at this intersection of law and technology ever since, and the majority of that time spent doing computer forensics and incident response work, as I mentioned.
Terrific. We're going to get right into it, but I would be remiss if I didn't say one thing, and that is Ackerman does have an office in San Antonio, so very proud of that. And what I'm going to do here is, how many people in the room, by show of hands, remember the show that was on PBS, the McLaughlin Group? Remember John McLaughlin? And while we don't have some of the other people here from that organ, I'm not John McLaughlin. I'm going to sit down and we're going to kind of have the same conversational style about the topics we're going to discuss today, and hopefully keep you all awake between now and lunch. So let's talk about the cyber threat landscape to kick things off. And we're going to be talking about this primarily from the perspective of the private sector.
And Jason, even though I moved this slide and it apparently went back to where it was,
We can move it again.
yeah, well, it's got the, that's all right, it's got the build in it, so we won't.
Well, you might as well, yeah, expose it all.
Yeah, right. So we're going to expose the whole slide here. And let's see, we're going to go, here we go. This is probably my fault. Let's talk a little bit about what is a data breach. Data breach is a word that's thrown around quite a bit, but there are actually different forms of it. There are security incidents, there are security attacks, and there are security breaches. What's up on the screen here is a pretty generic definition of what actually is a data breach, and it's pretty broad if you look at it. It's really any security incident in which sensitive, protected, or confidential data is copied, transmitted, viewed, stolen, or used by an individual or group unauthorized to do so. And as we've talked a little bit, that matters because different states and different jurisdictions have different laws that talk about what you have to do or what you have to do to try to prevent one of these types of incidences. So we'll come back to that in a minute. All of you clearly have been reading the headlines over the last number of years, and the size and scope of data breaches that garner headlines have gotten bigger and bigger. And some of the largest ones are up on the screen right now. Many of these are household names, and I'm sure that you've read and heard about these if you weren't directly impacted by one or more of these data breaches. And one of the things about a data breach is it doesn't discriminate. Data breaches basically affect nearly every company. Some of the myths about data breaches are they only affect big companies like the ones you saw on the prior page. Well, that's not true. Data breaches affect companies of all sizes and shapes, and in fact, some of the smaller companies that are hit by data breaches are least equipped to deal with them, and oftentimes a serious data breach or other kind of security incident can be life-ending for that company. Just to give you some statistics from 2015, this is from IBM Security Services. These are the companies that IBM Security Services monitors. Out of those companies that they monitor, on average per year, there are over 52 million security events, almost 1,200 security attacks, and 178 security incidents, or what we might call a data breach. That's on average in 1 year.
You know, there's another piece to that, which is really fascinating. Because cybersecurity is so new and it's so ill-defined across various sectors, it's estimated that somewhere in excess of $400 billion a year is spent worldwide in recovering from data breaches. And that's kind of an overwhelming statistic. That's more than the majority of most nation states have as their gross product.
Yes, so that was a nice segue, thank you Keith, as data breaches indicate that this is a big expense, and as I mentioned, it can be life-terminating for some organizations when they experience one, and we'll get into some of those details later. I was at a meeting about a year ago with the FBI Chicago Division, cybersecurity specialist, and they were talking about what the top priority threats are for the FBI. And in order, they were number 1, terrorism, number 2, organized crime, number 3, cybercrime. And cybercrime is quickly eclipsing organized crime for the FBI's top threats. So it's very appropriate that we're talking about this topic here today, combining both terrorism and cybercrime as becoming almost on par in terms of threats faced by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. So
well,
now
of course,
let's go back.
and just one comment on that. One of the reasons for that is, of course, organized crime is investing very heavily in cybercrime. So hackers for hire are finding lucrative careers working for organized crime groups around the world, largely Eastern Europe. But
right, and that's a good point. Those 3 top threats are all sort of blending together. They're all becoming very, very interrelated. So now let's go back to the cyber threat landscape and talk a little bit, and Jason, if you can kick us off, let's talk about security incident causes and consequences. I mean, what types of security incidents are we seeing out there nowadays? Where do they often come from? The prior panel talked a little bit about the insider, actually quite a bit about the insider threat vector, but what are some of the other things that you're seeing?
Yeah, so I'll probably emphasize a little less the insider threat, not because I think it's less important, because I think the last panel did such a great job talking about it, and I'm very happy to see that, because I think that is often the one that doesn't get enough attention. So, so definitely, if I look at the incidents that I've worked, so many of them either were had an insider who was responsible for carrying out the theft, Or, you know, as I think the Colonel said on the last panel, that somewhere along the line there was an insider involved that either facilitated an attack. So very, very important to focus on insiders. But I think, you know, to a large extent, we've been using the same, I mean, honestly, I've probably been using a variation of this slide to talk about the threat landscape and the different actor groups for 10 years. So it hasn't changed that much in terms of how we classify these threat actor groups. What has changed, though, is the degree of threat posed by each of these types of attackers. So I think one thing we can say is that the hacktivist groups have faded a little bit in prominence and their effectiveness in doing damage. Anybody remember Anonymous? You know, they were extremely active, you know, probably almost 10 years ago now that they really hit the scene. And I think you got to credit law enforcement and the intelligence organizations for really doing a good job of dismantling those kinds of groups, Anonymous in particular, by undermining trust. I mean, all these groups rely on trust among members, and law enforcement was able to identify a couple of these people and get them to flip on their comrades, and that is usually a good way to get rid of them. State-sponsored attackers, without question, have become a lot more active. Number one, there are more states involved in these kinds of activities. But I think the other reason that we've seen such an increase in the reports of state-sponsored activities is, frankly, we've gotten better at detecting these kinds of actors, and so we hear more about them. You know, and I think, you know, we already mentioned the blending of the organized crime and the criminal operators in with some of these other groups, including state-sponsored actors. I mean, there's no question there are people who are, you know, conducting cyber operations on behalf of their nation state during the day. When they go home in the evening, they're making some extra cash for themselves or for organized crime. Same groups, same tools, and that's the other thing we're seeing. You know, we saw with the WannaCry ransomware attack that there were allegedly some tools that had been stolen from the NSA that were used by the attackers, and that happens a lot. You know, if you think about cyber warfare and the weapons that are used by states in cyber warfare, it's not like a cruise missile where you launch it and it pretty much destroys itself along with whatever you aimed it at. These cyber tools are still out there, and somebody can pick them up and throw them back at you. And it doesn't even necessarily have to be the group that you targeted in the first place. Once these tools are out in the wild, it's very difficult to control their proliferation. So that puts these tools in the hands of different types of people. It also makes attribution extremely difficult. It's very hard for a cyber investigator to tell, was this the Chinese, or was it the North Koreans pretending to be the Chinese, or was it an organized crime organization pretending to be the North Koreans pretending to be the Chinese? It's very, very complicated and difficult. But you know, I think we're going to talk more about this later, but I think the other thing that we've got to talk about today is ransomware. It is a game changer in a lot of ways in how it operates, and the economic model of it is just so appealing to attackers that we're just beginning to see the early stages of that vector.
Absolutely, and we will talk about that quite a bit in a moment. I just want to go forward because another common misconception is that cybersecurity is a technology problem. It is not a technology problem, as the prior panel explained, which leads me to one of my favorite cartoons, which is this one. That you can have the best firewalls and virus protection on the planet, but if you're dealing with Bob, the person who works for your company and doesn't follow the policies and doesn't update his password and doesn't put the password on a post-it note that's on his screen, and all those things, it doesn't matter. It only takes one person to click on a phishing email to disrupt the best technological security that you may have. So this is one of my favorite cartoons, and it reminds me of the phrase that Commodore Perry famously said in 1813, which is, "We have met the enemy and they are us." I think somebody mentioned the statistic that 60% of all cyber attacks or data breaches are directly traced back to insiders, either those with malicious intent or those who served, like Bob, as inadvertent actors. So what this really brings up is it's really about people. You need that triangle of people, process, and technology. Yes, technologies are important. Process and protocols are very important. But if people don't follow those protocols and know how to use the technology, then the whole triangle fails and you have a problem. We'll talk a little bit about spear phishing and phishing and ransomware in just a couple seconds. Keith?
You know, and I expand on that. My definition of insider threat goes along a little bit more with Colonel Cote and with Dan Sutherland, and that is that it's not the difference between outside and inside. It's if somebody grabs my credentials or somebody else's credentials and gets inside your network, instantly, the minute they're inside your network, they're an insider. And the majority, and if you stop and think about all the hundreds of millions of dollars that have been spent on cybersecurity, most of it goes to the IT department for routers and switches and putting off this huge, what I call a crunchy outside, but very few people look at the real chewy inside. And so I define the cyber threat landscape as three products or three aspects. And we've touched on it briefly, but the first aspect is people. Every cyber event begins and ends with a person or people. It isn't a machine running wild and stealing your stuff. It's somebody out there trying to grab it. And it could be Dave, it could be Bob, it could be somebody who's acting like they're Dave or Bob. You just don't know. The second thing is the data. People don't understand where their data is, who controls it, who has access to it, what's important, what isn't important. And I can just tell you right now, there's a couple of great examples. One of them was Sony Corporation. I can say it because it was all over the paper. The Sony Corporation had a huge data hit, and it actually ended up being the critical value data that brought down the CEO and a couple of the boards of directors was the executive email strings. And they just didn't think that was critical data to them. And so every corporation has to sit down and say, what is the data that I have to protect? And then design and that's the last thing, is the process and the systems. Because if you begin by creating a cybersecurity system that begins with the IT department, it will always fail. Because remember, the first is the person. And if you put in a IT system or a tool and you leave it alone, that person will figure out a way around that tool.
Absolutely. Quick question. Every year there's a survey done of the worst passwords that people utilize to protect all this information. Anybody want to garner a guess as what year after year after year after year is the #1 worst password? I see someone already doing it with their hands in the back.
Password.
Yes. It is, in fact, year after year, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Followed by password. And then somebody who wanted to get a little bit more secure went 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. But this is the problem that we're talking about here. And a quick story to illustrate this. By show of hands, you don't have to necessarily implicate yourself by raising your hand. Anyone read about the Ashley Madison data breach? Does everyone know what Ashley Madison is? It was a website where folks would go, married people would go to try to find someone else to cheat with. And you would think that if you had an account on Ashley Madison, you'd want to keep it pretty secure, right? If you were going to do that. Well, when that leak happened, and there were about 6 million encrypted accounts in Ashley Madison that were put out on the web, there were some researchers that grabbed a bunch of them just to see, well, how secure are these accounts? They cracked 4,000 of them in 5 days. And the most popular password that was used on Ashley Madison were clearly you wanted to be very, very low key and hide, right? You guessed it, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And again, next password was password. So this is the human element in play. Even when someone has a deep personal reason to try to keep something secret, people just don't do it.
You know, one note on passwords, I don't know how many people saw this, but Nist, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, that has been doing a tremendous amount to create and publish and offer for free a variety of different cybersecurity frameworks and guidelines. They issued new guidance saying that companies should no longer force password changes every 30 days or every 90 days. That's actually counterproductive. I don't know if you guys I actually happen to agree with NIST 100% on that, but I don't know if you guys have.
Well, I have an interesting perspective from a person who has established and run an insider threat and counterintelligence program at a major U.S. agency. And over 2 years, we opened 56 different cases, found foreign intelligence penetration, and guess what the agency director said to me? Stop your work, you're embarrassing us.
Wow.
that was the response. And it goes back to the Nist. Don't do anything hard, don't do anything complex, because we don't want to stir up the data.
Well, the passwords, I think there was a survey done that said people would rather clean a toilet than think of a new password. And I'm one of those people. I can't stand it, so pick a good password.
Well, you just write them all down on a Post-it and stick them on your monitor, and you're fine, right? That's all you need to do. Well, we promised we were going to talk about phishing and ransomware and spear phishing, so let's talk about some of the emergent risks and challenges. I don't know how emergent they are anymore, but they are certainly challenges. So this slide really introduces the conversation about spear phishing and phishing. If you don't know what a phishing email is, or a spear phishing email, or email spoofing, which is another term, I'll give you a quick example. 2 months ago, we had a client that fell victim to an email spoofing scam. Basically what it was is an email came in to about 2,500 employees that purported to be from the CEO of the company. And the email said, it looked like it came from the CEO. It said, very important communication that requires your participation. This has to do with the future of the company and compensation of all in the organization. Well, you better believe a lot of people who got that on their phone started clicking on it. And once they opened up the email, there was an attachment that, again, looked like it came from the CEO of the company, and they were supposed to open up the attachment and then put in their company username and password in order to view this document, because you had to do that in order to access it because it was company confidential. Well, of course, this was a spoofing email, and all that did was just give the malicious actors now the username and password for everyone in the organization that opened the email and clicked on it. And to Keith's point, now they were in. What they then did was figured out that all the employees in the company also used the same username and password to access their third-party hosted HR, payroll, and benefits plan. So it went right into that system and took 108 people's direct deposit information for their payroll and changed it to the bad actor's green dot account. And so when payroll came around, whoop, all the money went somewhere else. And this was only discovered when one of the employees called up and said, gee, where's my paycheck? And there was an investigation, and sure enough, this was discovered. And the third-party payroll company didn't notice it because this was someone who had credentials to the system. These happen all the time, and this actually didn't turn out to be that bad of a situation, although it did require the company to report to data subjects in 26 different states and notify the attorney generals of 6 different states, all for this one incident. So this can be a really big deal. And as the stats up here on the screen indicate, 23% of recipients now open phishing emails, and 11% will open the attachments. 50% will open them within the first hour, and the reason being these things. You get an email from someone that appears to be from someone very important within your organization and your life, and you're on your phone, you're on the train, you're standing in line buying groceries, you're not even looking, you're clicking on it, and it's already too late. And in the instance that I just described a moment ago, I think about 2/3 of the people that clicked on the email and clicked on the attachment and entered their credentials did so on their smartphone. So training, how do we avoid this? How do people recognize that this email is something they should be clicking on? I mean, no longer it's from some Nigerian prince who wants you to send them $5,000 by Western Union. These are getting much more sophisticated. They're using social engineering. What do we do to stem the tide?
Yeah, they really have gotten a lot better. I know, I look and read this stuff, and I've come very close to clicking on a couple of them. They're so much better in the last 2 years. They've gotten a lot better than they used to be. So it is very difficult to spot them. But I think, human beings, the good news is that human beings can be trained. We are very trainable. And we can be, transformed from the biggest threats that our organizations have into information security detection devices. Because even if, and this is really, really important, we talk about culture of security. Part of creating a culture of security is certainly what we've been talking about, which is making sure we're all being vigilant. But an equally important, if not more important aspect of creating a true culture of security is making sure that people feel comfortable reporting and coming forward when they do click on something bad. Because there is a window, and the length of that window is open varies a lot, but it's not a heck of a long time. But there is a window during which action can be taken to prevent any actual harm from occurring, even if you've clicked on something bad and launched something nasty in your environment. So users, in addition to being made aware of these threats, have to be encouraged and made to feel comfortable reporting them. and saying, hey, I made a mistake, I clicked on something knowing that they're not gonna get in trouble, that they're gonna be rewarded and appreciated for coming forward with something like that. And so I really think it's turning people into not just prevention devices, but also detection devices, so that we can come forward and say, we need to do something here.
Yeah. I have an interesting story, and I hope you'll bear with me because it goes back to what we're talking about, but it expands a little bit. There was a group of individuals at a place where I used to work who, within about a 6-month period of time, brought in their laptops to have them reconfigured because it inadvertently clicked on a phishing scam and it infected their computer. And when it infected their computer, the only thing that we could do was take it to the IT department, and they would rescan, re-image the laptop and give it back to them, and they'd start over again. But as we sat there and we just did a little bit of analysis, and we said, okay, out of all of these re-imaging requests, how many have come in multiple times in the last 60 days? And 5 people showed up. And they had come in once every 30 days to have their laptop re-imaged over the past 6 months. And we thought, why would somebody want to keep getting their laptop re-imaged? So we started looking very specifically at each of these re-imaging requests, and what we discovered is just before they got their download click, they received an email from outside that says click. And what happened is we discovered that there was actually an outside controller who was watching the internet, watching the interior operations of this organization, and they knew that we were trying to find out who these people were, and when they would think that the person on the inside was close to being discovered, they would send them a link for them to click on, so that they would bring their laptop in, and by re-imaging it, we would destroy all of the evidence of everything that they had taken over the past month. That's a little complex, but I'm just here to tell you that organized crime and nation states will hire people to come into your organizations, and they will control them, and when they get too close to being caught, they will use this technique so that they erase off their laptop all of their image that they've done anything wrong. That happens.
Wow, that's pretty frightening. Before we leave this topic, one thing that can be done within organizations is similar to penetration testing to test the technological barriers that a company puts together. Is I know in many organizations there will be internal phishing emails that are sent out just to see who clicks on them. And again, not to punish them, but to remind them as a learning experience, a learning exercise that this is a fake email, you need to be able to better recognize what these are. So the company actually, the IT director or someone that's a chief information security officer will send those around internally to test the training that have been given to employees so that they don't do it when they really come in from the outside. Ransomware. We've already heard a little bit about ransomware and the WannaCry attacks, obviously, in still May, earlier this month, were huge and caught a lot of attention, shut down hospitals and whatnot. And it really brought, I think, to the living room the issue of ransomware. And Jason, you mentioned a little bit about the financial model of ransomware, and the way I understand it, so let me know what you think, is traditionally we think of people going out and bad actors wanting to steal credit card information or identity or getting in your bank account, either to get money from you or they want to get something and then put it on the dark web and sell it for some profit. But that model is completely different than this. This is, I don't have to go sell anything. All I have to do is lock your stuff up and then make you pay me to get it back.
Yeah, I mean, it really is pretty close to the perfect cyber criminal tool and methodology because, you know, first of all, it's getting harder and harder to resell credit card numbers. They're worth much less than they used to be. The credit card companies have gotten pretty darn good at detecting fraudulent activity. We've gotten better as consumers at reporting these kinds of things and you know, getting our cards replaced. So the cards are worth less. Even when you have, certainly there's still a very active market for Social Security numbers and other personal information that can be used for identity theft. It's still difficult. You've got to have some level of sophistication to know where to go to sell these kinds of things and make sure you're not selling them, you know, to the and so there's some level of sophistication that you need in order to do that. Ransomware, literally all you need is this pretty nifty little piece of malware and the ability to send anonymized, obfuscated emails, spear phishing emails, which, you know, any of us could leave this room today and be up and running, sending ransomware ourselves, you know, within an hour. If anybody's interested, talk to me afterwards. But the reason it's so beautiful is that it is direct. I hit you and you pay me. And it's directly into my Bitcoin account or whatever method I'm using. Instant gratification, and I can measure my success, you know, on a daily basis. What were the profits today? It's really a beautiful, beautiful economic model for the hackers.
And lest anybody think that it's not successful, in the United States alone, in the last 6 months, many hospitals and healthcare companies have paid tens of thousands of dollars to unlock their systems that were locked by the ransomware. Individuals are paying multiple dollar amounts, and guess what? Do you think that if you pay the amount that they've released your system from their control?
Nope.
Correct. The answer is no. They still control your account. And so I think it was Dr. Jeff Barnett that mentioned the only way to do this is to make sure that you have a couple of things in practice and that you practice good cybersecurity health, which is separating accounts, making sure you have regular backups. Because I can tell you what, if my doctor all of a sudden said, you know what, I just lost all of your healthcare information, including all of your surgical history and all of your medical stuff, well, I'm glad they paid the money, but on the other hand, I'll never go back to that doctor. But how do you find another doctor? So you are stuck as the victim of this, even though you're not participating.
You know, I think the biggest threat to the ransomware business model is actually the bad guys themselves, because really, for the first few years that these attacks were starting to proliferate, the attackers were actually quite reliable in actually unlocking your data when you paid. And that's obviously a very important part of this model. If we all realize, you know what, they're not going to unlock stuff anyway, then we're not going to pay them, and they're not going to make any money. So there was this sort of honor among thieves for a number of years, and that is starting to fade. I think we heard with WannaCry that a lot of the people who paid never got the keys, and that is going to undermine my prediction. If anything is going to undermine this, it's that people are just going to stop paying and realize that they need to back up their data, and when this happens, you just brick your machine and start over.
Yeah, interesting spin on this. We're talking about healthcare organizations, other organizations whose data's been locked up, encrypted, and unless a ransom is paid, it won't be released. That's obviously a problem that can be a fatal blow to many organizations that can't survive without getting their data back, which is why they pay it. But here's another scarier angle on this. How many of you are staying in a hotel or have stayed at a hotel recently where your key card that you were given at the front desk, you just waved it in front of the door to unlock it? They didn't actually stick it in. So it's the Marriott across the street, right? Well, earlier this year in a hotel in Austria, the form of ransomware that took place there was the bad guys accessed the system and locked all the doors in the hotel and wouldn't unlock them until the ransom was paid. Now, fortunately for that hotel, the guests were not in the room at the time, but imagine if you were in your room at the time and couldn't get out. Or imagine that you're sleeping peacefully in your room at 3 o'clock in the morning, all of a sudden all the doors are unlocked. Just think of all the personal security issues that go along with that and what the motivation could be for someone to pay a ransom. So I think we're going to see more iterations of this kind of attack as it pervades other industries that may have thought, well, what do I care? I don't need to worry about ransomware. Well, you betcha you do. I could think of a few public facilities that might have a little problem that they were locked out of their systems and couldn't run them for even short periods of time, and might be very motivated to pay the ransom to get those systems back online.
Hey, let me ask you a question, Counselor, if I may. I've had some...
I reserve the right to...
Yeah, and I don't want to derail us, but interesting question. If you refer back to our definition of data breach, right, which was an unauthorized access or...
Right.
Unauthorized obtaining of information. Is a successful ransomware attack a data breach?
That's a very good question. It's one I get all the time, and let me answer it this way, because the answer to me is in most cases yes. But you don't even have to take my word for it. The Office of Civil Rights, a healthcare institution, a covered entity that has to follow the security rule under HIPAA. If you're a victim of ransomware, there's already an opinion from the OCR that you have to report that. No different than any other data breach involving protected health information. And we'll get into this in a second, the state data breach notification laws of a number of different jurisdictions, depending on how they define access, it's not acquired, it's just access, would mandate a notification to the data subjects and potentially the state attorney general's office. So as far as protected health information, the answer is definitely. In the other cases, the answer is probably. So let's move on to something that's also very interesting and a big buzzword of recent, because then I do want to get into all the doom and gloom of regulatory enforcement and liability for all this stuff. What exactly is the Internet of Things? We all hear about IoT this, we hear about Internet connected toys, Internet connected this, Internet connected that. How many people in this room are wearing a Fitbit? You're all IoT right now. You're all connected to the Internet. You've got a device that's on your body that is collecting and sending data all the time without you doing anything about it. There's no exact definition of what the Internet of Things is, but the Federal Trade Commission defines it as the ability of everyday objects to connect to the Internet and to send and receive data. The FTC said that in 2011, for the first time, the number of things connected to the Internet outnumber the number of people on this planet. And that it is estimated that there are currently over 25 billion connected devices right now, and by the year 2020, there will be more than 50 billion connected devices, all collecting and transmitting data all the time. There are a lot of risks to these devices because a lot of them aren't necessarily built with security in mind. And as we'll talk about the botnet attacks that happened recently and how internet-connected devices were turned into zombie armies to launch a denial of service attack. A lot of these devices are very quickly designed to get them out to market, and they're sent out and they're never updated, they're never checked. They usually have a factory installed password, which is easily found, and no one ever bothers to do anything because you're not treating it like your phone or a laptop. It's just some $12 piece of plastic that you bought and you're not even thinking about it. So the risks to the Internet of Things as it grows and grows are threefold. Number one, enabling unauthorized access to and misuse of personal information in these devices. So for example, the Mirai attack that turned closed caption TV cameras and DVR recorders into a zombie army that then launched a denial of service attack that affected and took down directly and indirectly PayPal, Airbnb, Netflix, and a number of other sites for a considerable amount of time. So these devices, which aren't very secure to begin with and nobody pays any attention to update them, are being identified as things that can be attacked. Number two is mentioned that these devices can facilitate attacks on other systems, and they can also create a risk to personal safety. If someone can hack a device, an internet-connected device, you may not worry too much about your Fitbit, because what are they going to do, make it explode on your wrist? But what if you have an implanted defibrillator that is connected to the internet? If someone hacks that and suddenly decides to turn it on or off, it's already been shown that internet-connected cars can be shut down remotely, or the braking system's disabled. And this goes on and on and on. So this has become a much bigger issue in terms of data security and data privacy, and the issue of privacy by design or security by design is a much bigger challenge right now. And then the question of who's liable for these things. Are they in fact defective products because they're not designed with minimal reasonable security measures? And is this a whole new category of products liability that's moving? Gentlemen, thoughts? Are you both connected to the internet?
Yes. You know, it's interesting that there's a couple things that come to mind. Ted Koppel wrote an interesting book, and I don't know if anybody's read it, but it's about the power grid across the United States and how vulnerable it is. And I learned something when I read his book, and I thought it was just fascinating, that our entire power grid is made up of individually engineered substations. And that if one goes down, you can't just go buy it off the shelf. It has to be engineered, and most of them are engineered overseas, and they take 3 to 5 years to build, and they weigh several hundred tons, so it's hard to move them in. The power grid is probably one of the most vulnerable things we have, simply because of what you were just talking about. Now, if you look at other things, other aspects, if you have a pacemaker, a defibrillator, or if your pet has an identification chip implant, all of those things can be controlled by somebody other than you or your doctor. And that's just amazing to me. I have a really good friend who has deep brain stimulation performed to keep his hands from shaking. And he sits there and controls the amount of electricity that goes in with a little hand controller. And the doctor said, when I've implanted it, you need to make sure that nobody gets that hand controller, because if they alter the voltage at an inopportune time, it will do harm to you physically, or it could cause other problems to occur. That's just one aspect of it. And from the IoT perspective, if somebody decided, I want to mess with you, whether it be a friend or practical joker or somebody who just wanted to come in and say, I'm going to control your pacemaker or your defibrillator unless you pay me $50. That's another form of ransomware that we haven't seen yet, but it's coming.
Yeah, I think, I do have some, smart home devices, Nest thermostats. I got a Sonos system for my birthday that I love. I'm not giving that up. So I'm definitely wired in, and I understand the risks, and I think I understand that. I'm assuming those risks, and I understand the trade-off. Do I have any idea whether any of the devices in my home are being used by criminals to attack other devices and people? I have no idea. That's really the biggest issue today with the Internet of Things, is your devices being co-opted and used as part of one of these botnets, which, as a quick aside, puts an interesting spin on the discussion earlier about, is it okay to shoot somebody that comes into my house or comes onto my system? The sort of hacking back concept. Well, that gets really complicated if it's not a bad guy coming into to my shop and doing harm. It's Martin's refrigerator. Can I hack back Martin's refrigerator and take it out? Is that okay?
Alexa and Siri say yes.
Yeah, that's right. So I think it's really going to eventually, it's going to take some time, 5 to 10 years, but I think it's turning the security industry on its head, because if you think about what's been happening over the last 10 years is a movement towards centralization, cloud, and this is sort of pushing everything back out to the endpoints. Obviously mobile devices were already going that direction, but it's decentralizing everything again, and it makes, and we'll talk a little bit more about this I think later, but when you talk about where should you be focusing your security efforts, in addition to insider threat, it's at the endpoint. It's knowing what the heck these devices are capable of doing, and making sure we're engineering them in a way that makes them less susceptible to sort of co-option, but also monitoring them. Very, very active monitoring and understanding when they're doing something, not necessarily that's labeled bad, but just something they haven't done before, and making sure we're paying attention to that and understanding what that is. So that's the challenge we face.
I will ask Alexa to keep an eye on that, and so no one will hack Alexa and record everything that's going on in my house.
Please.
Yes.
I think it's safe to say that the world of cybersecurity is bigger than IT. We've talked about this before. It's much larger than a CISO or a chief security officer. It encompasses every aspect of our lives, and it's increasing every day. And really gets back to what my second point was about data. It's all about the data. So much of us is being expanded upon, and data is growing every day. I think I heard 17 petabytes of data a day for each individual is somewhere in that neighborhood. It's just huge that we're just growing so fast. And being able to sort through all of that data to get down to what's the most important aspect for me, and how do I protect myself, is really the key to the future. And I like the way you said about the endpoint. The Information Assurance Director of the NSA has said that the future of cybersecurity is the endpoint. And until we start grasping in greater concept these larger pictures and policy decisions, we're always going to be chasing security as opposed to being comfortable with it.
Well, you've now suffered, imagine that you've suffered a data breach. Your worst nightmare has occurred. It's either been ransomware or phishing email or malware has been ingested in your system, and you've had to deal with it. You've had to hire someone to do the forensic examination. You've had to hire lawyers to help you with this and that and otherwise. You've already been victimized and you feel like you've been violated. Well, I hate to tell you, but it's only just begun, because in the next 10 minutes, in the remaining time we have, I want to go through the regulatory enforcement and the liability landscape for data breaches. So you may feel like you're a victim because you just experienced a data breach, but again, your pain has only just begun potentially. So very briefly, at a very high level, because again, we could probably talk all day about some of these topics, there are a number, anywhere between 30 and 50, depending on how you count them, federal data privacy and data breach laws. And they govern different aspects of data in different industries. There is no, as was mentioned earlier today, there is no uniform law or standard in the United States. So one of the things that people have to do, depending on what industry you're in, is figure out what laws might govern you. If you're dealing with protected health information, then obviously you're subject to HIPAA. If you're a financial services company, you're dealing with Graham-Leach-Bliley and many other statutes. And then at the state level, particularly as if federal laws are to end up being relaxed or regulations are reduced, well, I predict what we can see is an increase in activity by the states, state legislatures, and also state attorney generals who will step into the void and take up action. This is going to create even more complexity, fluidity, and uncertainty, because right now, with New Mexico being the most recent state to pass a data breach notification law, there are now 48 states and a number of the commonwealths in the United States that have data breach notification laws. They are, for the most part, all different. Some require a notification at one time, some require notification under a distinction of whether it's accessed and acquired. Some have an analysis of what the risk of harm is. Some will not allow you to do that yourself. Some will require you to notify the data subjects, but only if there's more than 500 data subjects that are involved. Other states will require that you not only inform the data subjects, but you also write a very nice letter to the state attorney general's office. And for those of you that either represent or are with organizations, the state of Maryland will require you to send a notice to that AG, even if there's a single data subject. Shame for everybody to see, your competitors, your customers, everybody. So this is a big deal. And keeping up with all these changing laws and requirements can be very complicated, because in some jurisdictions, your notification requirement, it could be as little as 10 days. In others, it's 30 days. In others, it's as soon as reasonably practical, but without unreasonable delay, whatever that means. And you don't want to get second guessed. Fortunately, there are some tools out there now that will allow you to basically analyze all of these different laws that are changing over the course of time and plug in some key questions and get some answers back about what your reporting obligations are in any one particular jurisdiction in a matter of minutes as opposed to a number of hours. Some of the states have laws that go beyond this and even require certain data security measures, such as encryption of communication or requiring people to have a written security program. And don't worry about it, because if you don't notify on time, what can possibly happen to you? Well, a lot of these statutes have built-in penalties where it's so many thousands of dollars a day that you don't notify the data subjects. And some, in addition to allowing the Attorney General of that state to come after you for that fine, if you don't report on time or you don't report appropriately under the statute, also provide for private causes of action. So the data breach is just the beginning of the headache. I'm just going to cover a little bit of the rest of this, and then we'll come back and talk about this topic generally. In addition to the laws that are out there, a number of government agencies have taken up the sword of enforcing or trying to achieve better data security or investigating people who have had lax data security. I'm sure most everybody in this room knows that the Federal Trade Commission, the FTC, has basically positioned itself as America's privacy cop and has pursued a number of different companies successfully, either through settlements or through litigation, for having lax data security standards. The two things that the FTC looks for the most is either, number one, a company that is saying, for example, on their website or part of their privacy policy, that they are taking certain measures of data security that they are in fact not. That was the Wyndham case a number of years ago. Or, and this is the trickier one, that even if you're not saying anything about what you're doing or not doing in terms of data security, if you are collecting people's information and you are not taking what the FTC considers to be reasonable measures to protect them, that can also be, that can potentially lead you to an enforcement proceeding from the FTC as well. Other agencies have picked up this sword, and I'm not going to take the time to go through each and every one of them, but here we go. The Securities Exchange Commission is now investigating corporate victims of hacking for lack of either internal controls or timely disclosures to shareholders. So now having a data breach or a data security incident can result in a securities fraud claim or an investigation from the SEC. The Consumer Finance Protection Bureau has also been leaning on the parties that it regulates for not having adequate security. The Financial Industry Regulatory Authority, or FINRA, in October of last year stepped into this space by fining a broker-dealer $650,000 for a data breach by a third-party cloud service provider, even though there was no demonstrated harm that actually occurred from that breach. But simply having a breach occur, and not from the broker-dealer, but from a third-party cloud provider that the broker-dealer utilized, they got slammed by FINRA for $650,000. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention the New York Department of Financial Services. Effective March 1st of this year, the New York Department of Financial Services' new cybersecurity requirements for financial service companies went into effect. And compliance is 180 days from the effective date, so that's about September. This is, the New York Department of Financial Services is one of the most important financial regulators in the country, and it is widely expected that this framework that just got implemented, or adopted, I should say, become effective, is going to creep across the rest of the country and be adopted in other states. So a lot of people are taking notice of this. Who does it affect? It affects financial companies, mortgage companies, banks, insurance companies, and you might think, whew, I'm none of those, I don't have to worry about it. Well, those are the covered entities, but it also affects covered entities that may not be located in New York, but may have just one little branch or location in New York. It also covers the service providers that do business for those covered entities. So law firms and others who are service providers to these covered entities are captured under the regulations. Very quickly, we don't have time to go into what the regulations are, but they do adopt a sort of Nist, and Jason mentioned what Nist was, a Nist framework for security, and require things such as a written cybersecurity policy, a written incident response plan, annual submission of a certificate of compliance, annual, and in the event of a cyber event, which is broadly defined, reporting to the New York Department of Financial Services within 72 hours. If you thought reporting within 10 days was a problem, imagine if you have to do that in 72 hours while the you-know-what is hitting the fan, and you're dealing with all these issues. So this is a really big deal, and we're going to see a lot more come from this in terms of how companies start to comply with these new regulations as they become compliance date of, I believe, September 1st hits companies in New York and beyond. Let me pause there because we have one more topic, which is data breach lawsuits, because I don't want to forget about the plaintiff's bar, because after all this, and the SEC and the FTC get done beating you up, the state attorney general gets done beating you up. Then there's the plaintiff's bar, which is going to come in at the end and actually sue you. But any thoughts or comments on the regulatory actions?
Well, I think despite the acceleration of activity we've seen from the regulators, this is still very, very, very early days, and the regulators are still trying to feel their way around. It's important to remember when you're dealing with regulators, or even trying to anticipate how a regulator might react or respond to an incident, is that they probably know less about this than you do. And they're reading these regulations just like you are and saying, how the heck are we going to interpret this and enforce this? And they're scared. In my experience, the way you can turn a regulator against you the fastest is by making them feel that you're not telling them everything, and that you're withholding information. Now, I don't know anybody who intentionally does that when you're dealing with a regulator, but if you're uncertain and they ask you what seems to be a direct question, was there any personal information exposed as a result of this breach? And your honest answer at that moment is, no. Our forensic people have been looking, we do not believe so. 2 days later, if you have to go back and say, actually, in the course of our investigation, we've now determined there has been some personal information. But you told me 2 days ago, and you start to erode trust, and it makes things go south in a hurry. So make sure that when you're communicating, you're using measured statements. Based on our analysis so far, here's what we've done. We don't believe so, but here's what we don't know. Here are the things we're still working on, and making sure you're sharing that information. And I think the other thing I would emphasize is, because of the complexity and these sometimes contradictory regulations that you run up against, you really do need a lawyer sitting with you that understands this stuff, and somebody who understands the landscape and who can help you with your internal communications, your communications with regulators, and help you anticipate, potential lawsuits as we're moving to next.
And I just want to make something very clear. I'm not an attorney, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn Express. But there are 2 points that I want to bring out that kind of piqued my interest as we've been discussing things. One is the Nist checklist. Yes, the Nist and ISO, and there's all kinds of checklists that are out there. But in a high-tech cybersecurity world, I just want to emphasize the fact that a checklist expires the minute you put the last check on it. And those people who say, well, I did it a year ago, means that it's been a year and you haven't looked at your environment. That means you are obsolete. So although checklists have a valuable place in making sure that your hardware and other things are configured properly, you cannot rest on that laurel that checklist is going to keep going on. The minute you package it up and say, yes, I've done it, it's obsolete. And you have to go back and continually monitor. The second thing I want to talk about is it's really good for the federal government to regulate, for the state governments to regulate. But I just have to tell you this one story. There was a federal agency that I was working with, and they actually had in their possession some highly valuable intellectual property which was lost to a theft. And when we sent this notification internally to the regulator, and they said, you probably need to notify the owners of this IT. Their response was, quote, well, it doesn't meet the regulatory criterion of notification. And that just blew me away because it was worth hundreds of millions of dollars in intellectual property, but it did not meet the regulatory criterion. So, God bless attorneys, we need them, but when you have an attorney responding only to the requirement of the law as opposed to what the customer is expected to do, those two things may not be the same. In this case, the client was never informed that their intellectual property was missing, or that it left because the government attorney said it didn't meet the reporting criteria. So, just because it's supposed to be doesn't mean that you're going to get told that your stuff is missing.
Right. We are running over time, but if I can trespass on your patience for just 2 more minutes, this is our final slide. I just want to make a few points on this one, and then we'll break, and thank you for your patience. Data breach lawsuits are becoming more prevalent, and they're not just from the consumers, the data subjects whose data has been exposed. Everybody knows about the Target case and what happened there, and obviously a lot of consumers' information was made available, and the class action, actually a whole boatload of class actions were brought all across the country and eventually consolidated up in a multi-district litigation panel in Minneapolis. And the story there, of course, is that the source of that breach was the third-party HVAC vendor that had access to their systems, and the bad guys got through that into the Target system, and the rest is history. But it's not just the data subjects that are bringing these class action lawsuits. We're also seeing financial institutions bring lawsuits against companies like Target and others for having to replace cards for all their customers following a data breach, and the cost that they incur for having to do that. And shareholder litigation. As I mentioned, publicly traded companies who have data breaches or lack security are being sued by shareholders, saying that you've now devalued my investment because you didn't put in the right security measures, or you didn't report a data security event when you should have. So we're seeing more and more different class action lawsuits take place from different environments. The big issue that's out there right now is
Whoa.
that would be a security incident.
Definitely an insight.
I hope everyone's okay. The big issue right now is standing, because clearly where you have an incident where someone's information is taken and then they become the victims of identity fraud, you have harm. That's pretty clear. But what happens if you get a notice that your information has been exposed, but nothing's happened? You haven't had anyone charge anything to your card, your identity hasn't been stolen, really you're just afraid that something might happen. Do you have standing? Have you expressed concrete, particularized, and actual or imminent harm, which is the standard that the Supreme Court adopted in Clapper a number of years ago? And the answer is, well, maybe not. And the circuits are split on this right now. And then the Supreme Court came up with Spokio versus Robbins case more recently, which was dealing with not a data breach, but with a violation of the Fair Credit Reporting Act. And the question was, can someone establish harm for purposes of standing and bring class action for nothing more than a statutory violation? So there's some reporting requirement, for example, and instead of doing it on the 10th day, you did it on the 11th day. Well, you violated the statute, and therefore I have standing to sue you for violating the statute. Well, but have you really suffered any harm? Well, what difference does the 1 day make? If you can't show any harm, there's a real split in the circuits right now as to whether or not the allegations of something like that constitute substantial risk of harm. And I suspect what we're going to see is the Supreme Court is going to revisit this issue post-Spokio, because we have a split with some circuits saying, for example, if the Seventh Circuit, my jurisdiction, in the Neiman Marcus case, simply by offering credit monitoring to the affected data subjects whose information was exposed, even though nothing happened to them, by offering them credit monitoring, the Seventh Circuit said, well, that indicates that there's a substantial likelihood of harm, or why else would you offer them credit monitoring? Proving once again that no good deed goes unpunished. And a couple other circuits adopt that approach, others don't. So we're going to get probably some more direction from the Supreme Court on this issue of standing in the future. Last word, both from the regulatory environment and the plaintiff's bar, one thing that is pretty clear is that if you are really trying to meet the reasonableness standard and doing what you can, you're probably not going to be the #1 target of the regulators or the plaintiff's bar. There are plenty of people who aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing or are saying one thing and doing another. It's kind of like that old story as if you're camping in the woods and a bear attacks your camp and you're all running away from the bear. Do you have to outrun the bear? No, you have to outrun the other guy. There's a moral in that story, and that's basically it. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry that we ran late.